2020, not quite the year that we hoped for or expected, but it is almost finished. But yet, at the same time, I remember seeing something on social media the other day. It was along the lines of, what if 2020 is just the movie trailer and the actual movie is 2021? And that just was like, ugh. And so as we come to the last message before 2021, the new year, I thought it would be good to kind of look at this idea of perseverance, because we don't know what 2021 might hold. It might completely change and be a good year, or it might be some of the same old as we've been dealing with here in 2020. And so we're going to look at this idea of persevering through the tough times. So even if it is another rough year, we'll be able to hopefully go through it well. And so I want to actually start with a definition, and I'm going to end with a definition. Obviously, I'm not in school anymore, and so I don't have a problem having definitions and school-type stuff during Christmas break. Obviously, some youth kids probably would have issues with this, but that's okay. Anyway, the definition of perseverance from the 1828 Webster's Dictionary is persistence in anything undertaken. So whether it's a school assignment, work day, surviving the in-laws, whatever it might be, it's that persistence in the undertaking that we have. Obviously, we as Christians have a few more things that we are undertaking than the general world has. And so one of those being bringing honor and glory to Christ in everything that we do, living out the greatest commandments, loving God, loving one another, working at the Great Commission, both witnessing both here in the local area and across the entire world and everywhere in between, and then just to grow in our walk with Him. Those are all things that we need to be persistent in those undertakings. 2020 definitely is not the worst year of all times. I'm not foolish enough to make that claim. Certainly for maybe individuals my age or younger, 2020 was definitely a rough year. It was definitely challenging, none to say the least. Whether it be COVID and obviously dealing with the sicknesses and the deaths and the quarantining ourselves and all that stuff, the shutdowns, the pauses, the local businesses that have been hurt by that, obviously the masks and the mandates with that, and the issues and the conflicts that's brought up among people. Of course, we had our toilet paper shortage earlier in the spring, and maybe threats of future toilet paper shortages, who knows. Obviously, earlier in the year, we had a bunch of protests and riots, burning down of various cities and public figures and stuff like that, and statues. And so, and then, of course, we had the election year, 2020 election, the election that keeps on giving. Who knows when that's going to end and what that's going to look like here. Obviously, we'll find out soon enough, I assume. But those are just the big public things that 2020 brought to each of us. There's certainly more personal matters that we have all gone through, that we've all struggled with, all have dealt with. By no means is this the worst of the worst, but obviously the Anchor building just got sold, and that was official this last week. And so bringing my keys to work has been a little bit different because they missing a few keys, and so the keys are a little bit lighter. And so the challenges that brought that had nothing to do with the general 2020, but yet just my 2020. And so we all have circumstances and situations that we have faced. A lot of them, like I said, are worse than some of those big things that I've mentioned. And so 2020 definitely has been a challenging year. And so this morning we're actually going to be looking at David and a psalm that he wrote while he was in a troubling time in his life. He had quite a few rough patches in his life. The one that we're going to be looking at was when he was on the run. He was on the run from one of two sets of people. Either he was on the run from Saul, who was the former king before him, and he was running from Absalom, his son, both of which were seeking to kill him so that they could be king or remain king. And so David wrote this psalm while he was on the run, while he was in the wilderness. And so if you have your Bible, Psalm 63, I'm going to read all 11 verses here to start. O God, you are my God. I shall seek you earnestly. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you, in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Thus I have seen you in the sanctuary, to see your power and your glory, because your loving kindness is better than life. My lips will praise you, so I will bless you as long as I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. My soul is satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth offers praises with joyful lips. When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I sing for joy. My soul clings to you, your right hand upholds me. But those who seek my life to destroy it will go into the depths of the earth. They will be delivered over to the power of the sword. They will be a prey for foxes, but the king will rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him will glory. For the mouth of those who speak lies will be stopped. So the psalm is kind of broken into three different segments. Verses 1 through 5 has kind of a present tense to it, the here and the now. Verses 6 through 8 has a past tense presence, remembering the past, and then verses 9 through 11 are in the future tense, what God's going to do. And so these are the three ways we're going to look in those three sections of ways that we can help to persevere through the tough times. And then within each of those three ways, we're going to be breaking them down and kind of looking at first some realities and truths that we see within those three, the reason why we should do those things, and then the third will be the outcome of if we're doing this, what is the outcome? What does it look like? And so the first one that we're going to look at is seeking God's presence. So one of the first truths, reality I want to mention is right off the bat there you see, oh God, you are my God. That aspect of my, the personal ownership. That always sticks out to me when I see that and read that and think about that, because that was very fitting for me and was key for my salvation, my start of my relationship with the Lord. Dating my wife in the time in college, not being a Christian, she would be witnessing to me, and she would always bring up the aspect of the personal relationship. And it took me a while, but I finally caught on, and I just remember one day in my room, and it just blew me away that the God of the universe, who created all things, everything, every person, but yet wants to have an intimate relationship with me, just blew me away. And so the aspect that God is a personal God. He's not a foreign God, not a distance God that barely has any interactions with us, but no, he has that desire for a personal relationship. And so that's, again, that just hits me on the aspect that it's my God, just like it was David's God, and hopefully he is your God as well. A couple other things that I want to note here. David, when writing this psalm, uses the I statement, personal responsibility aspect to it. But the reality is David wasn't alone. If he was running from Saul, it was him and about 400 men, plus women and children that were there. And then if he was running from his son Absalom, there were 600 men. And so David by no means was alone, but yet he still wrote this as it coming from him. And we'll look at it a little bit later on, but I want to bring up this fact that David had influence on, obviously, these people because they were willing to follow him through these trying times and stand with him. And so the reality is that David had influence on people around him. And the reality is you and me both have influence on people around us. So if I were to just do a simple example of, if I were to say something like, make sure you pick up every penny that you find on the ground. Now, if I were to say that at the store, more than likely the people are going to look at me and wish I would just move on and quit talking to them. But you never know. There might be the random stranger that was like, "Oh yeah, I'll buy into that. I'll do that." Obviously, a Sunday morning, I might say the same thing, and maybe a few more people are going to be looking at the ground, picking up pennies. I could probably go to the youth group, and there'd probably be a majority of the youth kids that would take eager hold of that and would do that because of the influence I have over them. But ultimately, if I were to go home, my kids, especially, they would see it as a competition, and they would just thrive off that, and they would be so excited to see pennies and find them and let me know that they found them. My youngest son, Lucas, is in that potty training stage, and so he is not shy to let you know, the random stranger or the fellow churchmate, that, hey, I just went to the bathroom. And so I just had a thing when we were cleaning out the anchor, the last little minor stuff, and he ended up going there, and then we went to the store to kind of give him a reward for going potty in a public place, and man, he was excited to just tell anyone and everyone that he went potty, and so he would definitely be one that if he found a penny, he would definitely let me know. The reality is, though, as much influence as I have on my kids or the youth kids or anyone else that might care to listen, the reality is, at the end of the day, the only person that I have control over is myself. And so there's no closer way to describe that and explain that, and the fact that I'm sure I'm not alone in this, the kids' Christmas program that happened a couple weeks ago, I know I wish I would have had maybe a little bit more control over what my kids said or did that Sunday morning. And I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure there's a few other parents that wish they could be like, I really wish you wouldn't have said that. But what can you do other than own it? And so that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to own it. So I am the proud parent of the boy who said that being famous means you have a rich bathroom. So that was my son that said that. My son was also the one that, when asked, how can you get the sheep to listen, to pay attention, he was the one that said, kick their butts. Kind of a side note, has nothing to do with the message, but I thought it was funny. When asked that question, what can you do to get the sheep to answer, I thought it was hilarious that all of the girls, they gave nice answers. It was kiss and cuddle and gentle words, and all the boy answers were kick their butts, hit with sticks, or send the dogs after them. And so just a difference between boys and girls there. Thankfully, the boys aren't currently shepherds at this time. Good for the sheep anyway. Another thing that I wish I could somewhat alter a little bit is my youngest son, Lucas, again. I'm just grateful that there was no props this year, because last year, if you remember, he was the one. I don't think he started it, but he definitely didn't help it. But I remember he was picking up the straw and he was throwing it all over the place. And so thankfully there was no props this year, and thankfully his Spider-Man tactics were on the down low, on the mellow side, because there was a couple practices that I was able to attend, and he was constantly shooting webs at the audience. And so I'm glad he didn't go too crazy. He did do a little bit of wandering around. The Fink girls, I got to hand it to them. They did an excellent job of, for the most part, just sticking to it and singing, even though Lucas was like practically running right around him. I did see a couple smiles from him, but they did an awesome job of staying focused despite my son running around. And so you get the idea that, again, as much influence as I have over my kids are still going to do stuff I wish they wouldn't do. Because in the end, they control them, I control me. And so that's just the way it is. The last truth, reality for this first section I want to mention is that David said he sought God earnestly. This has the idea of effort and energy. And this is going to look different for everyone. So an example of a morning devotional. Someone in here might be able to do a 20-minute devotional. Another person might be doing it with their kids, and they might only be able to do 10 minutes. Or there might be someone who has really young kids with short attention spans, and maybe they're only getting a minute. All different times, maybe they're putting in the same energy, the same effort. And so again, it's going to look different for everyone, but the important part is that we're putting the energy and the effort in on on it. There's going to be a couple times, if you listen to Pastor Tony's last sermon, it's going to be a little bit of deja vu for you. I was like, I remember listening last week, and I was like, hey, I'm going to bring up that passage, and while that story sounds a lot like my story, I'm going to bring up. And so there's going to be a couple times. I'm just going to go with either someone's listening to this that didn't listen to that one, or someone didn't pay attention the first time and they just need to hear it again, which is probably more realistic. But Psalm 51 is the psalm where David is confessing sin after he was told about his sin, that it didn't slip by God, his sin with Bathsheba, the adultery and the murder. And so it's his psalm of confession. And then verses 16 and 17 reads this: For you do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. It is the heart matter that matters. It's not fully on the energy and the effort, but is your heart in the right place as you do it. An example I've given to the youth kids a couple weeks back was the idea of prayer. If I were to say, hey, let's close in prayer, there'd be a couple hand gestures or actions, physical actions that you would do. You would fold your hands, more than likely. You take prayer out of this, and this just looks like the begging mom and dad that you can get something or you can go somewhere thing. And so it's the idea of we're asking and pleading to God for whatever it is that we're asking him for. You'd maybe bow your heads, or you'd take your hat off, or you'd get on your knees. All actions symbolizing respect and reverence for who it is that we're coming to. But the reality is, again, you could do all of those things, but if you're not meaning it, you're not honoring God. And so, again, the key is it needs to come from our heart. All right, moving on to the reason why we should seek God's presence. And that's simply because we thirst. I know I've given the example before of a cup. We all have a cup. Within that cup, we have stuff that we're able to then give out to people around us. But the reality is, if we're holding it out to the people to fill us back up when we run empty, we're going to be hurting, because that's not how we get filled. We have to turn that cup upright and be filled up by him. And so we're constantly running low, and we're constantly needing to be refilled. It said David actually says, in a dry and weary land. He was probably actually in a dry and weary land, but I think it would be safe to compare our world to that dry and weary land. And so kind of a little bit of maybe useless information for you, but nonetheless, you'll see I have a point to it. If I were to go to a restaurant and a waiter or waitress would come and ask me, hey, what can I get you to drink? And my choices were water, pop, milk, tea, juice, or coffee. If you know me, there's clearly one choice that I would pick, and that would be none other than pop. To me, pop is liquid gold. It is just delicious. It's fantastic. Talking about it makes me want to drink one, which I probably will after this. But I love pop. It's so delicious. But the reality is, pop has some consequences, which we'll look at here in a second. Sarah, my wife, likes to go on healthy kicks every once in a while. And so beyond exercising and eating healthy, one of the big things she likes to do is drink lots of water, making sure she's getting her daily amount. And so she'll every once in a while ask me how I'm doing, just to see. And thankfully, for the most part, when it comes to work, I don't bring pop to work, and so I have a water bottle. And so some mornings or some afternoons I can come home for lunch and be like, yep, I did pretty good with my water drinking. But other times when she asks, sometimes I just have to answer with, yeah, I just finished a 12-ounce can of water. Obviously, because pop's main ingredient is water, even though it's not quite the same thing. But as I was thinking about pop and thinking about water and all this, and then this idea of how we thirst and in a dry and weary land, and David was seeking God's presence, I think it'd be safe to assume and safe to go with the aspect that you could probably compare the world with pop and you could compare Jesus with water. And so pop, it tastes good in the moment. You can certainly get addicted to it and you want it, but in the end of the day, it's going to leave you thirsty, probably more thirsty than when you started. And then on top of that, if you drink a whole lot of it, it's going to cause a whole bunch of health issues. You're going to gain some weight, and a whole bunch of other things might stem out of that consumption of pop. Whereas on the other hand, you think of Jesus and you think of water. It's healthy. It quenches your thirst. It's good for you. John 4:10, Jesus, woman at the well. Jesus is that living water, and it's in Jesus that we can be satisfied, that our thirst can be quenched. The Christmas Eve service, a few words that were heavily mentioned: joy, peace, love, and hope. Through Jesus, those things are a reality. Those things are possible. Those things happen. The world can't offer that. They can only offer counterfeit joy, counterfeit peace, counterfeit love, counterfeit hope. But Jesus is the real deal. And so we need to make sure that we as Christians, we stop looking for the counterfeit water, for that pop that's not going to satisfy, not going to quench our thirst. We need to have that living water. And so David knew where to quench his soul. He knew that the only way he was going to be able to do that is in the presence of the Lord. And so he sought after him. And so we need to make sure that we're doing the same. We're not looking out to the world to quench our thirst, but we're looking to him to quench our thirst. The outcome of this, and you're going to notice a theme for the outcomes, but the outcome for this is praise and worship. You see in verses 3 through 5, it talks about lips and hands. With my lips I praise you, I lift my hands. Very much visible things that people see. It was very interesting. I've known Tony quite a bit, but I don't know if I've ever heard the college story that he shared and the struggles and challenges he had with the worship style versus what he was used to. The reality is me and Tony are very similar in that obviously we grew up in different ages, different locations in the United States, but very much similar when it comes to my raising at my church growing up. There was the organ that was played and hymns that were sung, and that was the only thing that we ever did music-wise. And so when I started dating Sarah, going to an E-Free church, very similar to the music style that we have here, it was definitely an adjustment for me. Obviously, all of the instruments being significantly louder, worship team up front, hands being raised, it was all made me, if I'm quite honest, made me a little uncomfortable at first. And for the most part, I just was like, whatever, they can do what they want. I'm just going to stand here and read the words, and if I agree with them, then I'll sing them type thing. But I remember in college going to a worship service that was run by Crew, and so it was all college students that were running the band and everything about it. And I just remember one time it just irked me watching this one person. He was kind of the MC of the night. So he would open in prayer, he would do announcements, he would introduce the worship team, he'd introduce the speaker for the night, all these things. And so he would be sitting up front, and I remember the worship band came up and they were doing their thing, and all of a sudden you could just see from the back that, I mean, he was just into the worship. He was just hands raised, swaying back and forth. I imagine his eyes were closed. But then the next moment, he is sitting there talking with his friend and laughing about some joke that was said. And then instantly back up to worship, and then conversation. Back up to worship, conversation. And so I just remember in my mature Christian self thinking, wow, that guy is the biggest phony in the world. He is not worshiping at all. And so then by virtue, everyone that I see that has their hands raised, they are doing it to get attention. Thankfully, God didn't leave me in that immature stage and actually matured me. And a couple things I remember taking out of just time just that God spent with me is the aspect that I can't see their hearts. I can't see that person up front and if he's truly worshiping or not. And then secondly, I was so focused on him, I was missing God altogether. My focus needed to be on him. And so I needed to deal with myself. Uh, the point, though, that I do want to make with this when it comes to this aspect of visible things uh, is that if we are in God's presence, it should be noticeable. Now, I'm not saying that everyone needs to be raising their hands while singing or stuff like that. But the reality is if you're not walking with the Lord very well, and then all of a sudden you are, there should be a difference in appearance. There should be a difference in attitude. There should be a difference in your speech and your conduct. It should be noticeable if we are walking with the Lord and we're in his presence. And so we got to make sure that that is the outcome that we have when we're doing that. The second thing, and persevering through the tough times, is remembering God's power. A few truths, realities, verses 6 through 8. So it's only 3 verses, but yet it has 4 times where it says the word you and 2 times where it says your. All that to say the focus is on God and his power and his ability to help. It's not our power, it's not our friends, it's not our family, it's not the government or anything else that we need to be relying on their power. It's his power that can help us through these tough times. I heard it said once, to some degree I think it's a pretty accurate statement, good kind of a check for us to do. Obviously there's certain circumstances where it makes sense for it to be, but I heard once that the last thing that you think of before you go to sleep might be your God. And so if every night you go to bed and you're constantly thinking about work, or you're constantly thinking about this person or this sports team or whatever, the reality is you might be struggling with an idol. Obviously, again, there's obviously circumstances where I'd imagine college students or high school students, you got that finals week, that big test. I'd imagine the night before you're thinking of that subject and the test you have tomorrow. So obviously there's different circumstances why it's not. But I think for the most part, if it would be a good test for us to check and see, is God the last thing I'm thinking of? Because that was what David was doing. On his bed, he was thinking about the Lord. And the night watches, he was meditating on him. He was constantly thinking, and his focus was on God. So we need to make sure we're checking ourselves and what it is that is our God. Is it actually him, or is it something else? Again, we see in those verses the I statement, the personal ownership that David had. Again, it mentions the words meditate and cling. These are, again, earnest effort, things that they certainly come natural to us, but they are usually focused on something else. We're usually meditating or clinging to something or someone else when it needs to be him. A best example I can come up with when it comes to this idea of our soul clinging or being under the shadow of a wing is if you've ever been around a little kid with their mom and dad there, and maybe you are talking to them, or their mom and dad said, oh, hey, I'd like you to meet so-and-so, and all of a sudden they just get a little bit nervous, and they immediately go right behind mom and dad, and they're just clinging to them, and of course doing the natural kid logic thing of I'm just going to bury my head into your leg, and if I can't see you, you can't see me. And so the reality is I think we need to have that type of mindset when it comes to God, just clinging to him. Not so much to the close my eyes, I can't see any of the problems around me or the problems that I'm dealing with. We certainly need to own up and take responsibility for our actions and for the stuff that we need to take care of. But I think if we're able to cling as close to God as a kid clings to their parent, we can see the problem through God's eyes. And so the problem that is before us, God is working out for his glory and for our good. And we're able to see that when we're clinging to him. Or maybe you have that individual that is just irking your chain, that's just bugging you. And if you're able to see that person through God's eyes, maybe you realize that person's lost. That person needs me to go and to witness and to bring them to Christ and to a relationship with God. And so begin to shift and change in your view and your thinking when we're clinging to God like we should. Moving on to the reason why we should remember God's power, is I'll just ask this question. Obviously, being a camera, you can't answer, so I'm not going to waste too much time. But if I were to ask you what was last week's fill in the blanks, the reality is maybe a few of you, maybe if you have your books handy, you could turn to it, but maybe a few of you could just name them off right away. Object, truth, and walk were the three fill in the blanks from last week. The reality is I could go, how about the week before, or how about the month before? The reality is you would probably forget what those fill in the blanks are, simply because we are forgetful people. Our memory is not very good when it comes to a lot of things. This certainly is nothing new. David, way back then, had the same issue that we do nowadays. Every once in a while, I have to struggle and I have to call my wife for help. Whether it's a school thing or maybe a doctor thing, I have to fill out all the kids' names and all the kids' birthdays. And I found a system that helps me with 3 out of the 4. So Titus was my firstborn, so the first month of the year, January, and then he was 23rd. And so I take that 3 at the end of 23rd, and I turn that into the year, 2013. Jasmine, 2 months later, so 3, her day is 5. Take that 5:15. Lucas then is 5:27. Take that 7:17. Rose should be in July, should be something with a 9. She's none of those. And so she is April 24th, 2019. And so a couple weeks ago, I had to call and ask. I was like, this is the one kid I don't know. Is this right? Okay, it's right. Again, we are forgetful people that tend to not remember certain things or remember all things for that matter. Israel, like I said, David's time certainly had that. They had celebrations, they had monuments that were built to help them remember the certain things that God had done in the past for them as a nation. This next week, we're going to be celebrating communion. That is, again, a thing that helps us remember what God did on the cross some 2,000 years ago. And so we all need help remembering. The remembering helps us keep the focus on where it needs to be. It helps us keep the focus on the problem solver and not the problem. And so when we face that problem, if we remember, God did this in the past, you're going to spend less time focusing on that problem. You're going to spend more time focusing on Him and what He's going to do about that issue, about that person, about that trial that you're going through. As I mentioned, David had gone through some horrible stretches in his life. Obviously, again, the psalm was written in one of those, but even during this horrible stretch that he was facing, he could still recall God's goodness. He could still recall how God had met his needs in the past, how He hadn't ditched him, that He was with him, that He was his help. He was that shadow over him. He was his protector. So David, even in these tough times, he was still able to remember God's power and God's goodness. And so we need to make sure we're kind of doing the same. As I mentioned, 2020 wasn't the greatest year for a lot of us, but yet the reality is good stuff still happened. God's blessings still poured out on us. And so a kind of a side challenge for us would be by the end of the year, I would spend some time and just reflect on the blessings, the good things that have happened through 2020. Kind of like that hymn says, count your many blessings. And so that's a kind of a little challenge for us, myself included, because a lot of times we remember the bad things. We don't remember the good things. And so we got to make sure that we take time and energy and effort into counting those blessings, and then our attitude can change with that. When it comes to the outcome, again, you're going to see a common theme here. It said, sing for joy. Here's that idea of praising God again. It's kind of an outward showing of an inward reality. Often the songs that we sing are actually just a reflection of past times. So if I were to give an example of if we were to sing Amazing Grace, I once was lost, but now I'm found, every one of us would have a unique remembrance of, hey, what it was like before Christ, how He got a hold of us, how we're found now, and the outcome and the change that has happened in each and every one of our lives. And so we all have those unique memories, and so singing and praising and the songs we sing, a lot of times that's what it is. It's a reflection on what God has done, and obviously we can just sing in general to that, but some songs might have certain meanings and reminders for us that affect us personally. The third and last thing for persevering through the tough times is anticipating God's judgment. As I was thinking about this, anticipating is just a fancy word for waiting. Waiting on God's judgments or God's promises might be another word you could use. Some truths and realities from this is we are going to have trials. We're going to have adversaries. I want to read for us John 15, 18 through 25. This is Jesus talking to his disciples, and this is what he has to say when it comes to this. If the world hates you, you know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not have sinned. But now they have no excuse for their sin. He who hates me hates my Father also. If I had not done among them the works which no one else did, they would not have sinned. But now they have both seen and hated me and my Father as well. But they have done this to fulfill the word that is written in their law. They hated me without a cause. People were seeking David's life. They wanted to kill him. Christmas just happened. We celebrated the birth of Jesus. Shortly after his birth, King Herod was seeking to kill Jesus' life. Hopefully that doesn't happen to us and we don't have people seeking our lives. Hopefully it doesn't come to that. But the reality and the truth is that we're going to have adversaries, we're going to have trials, simply because of life and simply because we are his. We belong to him. And because of the name that Christianity is associated with, there are going to be people who dislike us just because of that fact. And so we have to understand that we're going to have these trials, we're going to have these adversaries that don't like us. The next thing, truth, reality, kind of goes without saying with the text, both the Christmas text and the text we've read this morning with the idea of these guys hunting David down, is that our adversaries will be ruthless. The armies that Saul or Absalom sent for David didn't matter how many other people they had to kill. They would have killed the entire 400 or entire 600 men plus women and children to get to David to kill him. And they would have seen that as a success. You go to the Christmas story with King Herod. He had no problem killing every 2-year-old boy or younger in order to try and kill Jesus. And so our adversaries are going to be ruthless. But our adversaries and our trials, though, are going to have limits, whether it be time or whether it be degree. I always have a challenge when it comes to Sunday mornings because on Wednesdays, my general ministry is to kids who are younger than me. And then on Sunday morning, it is to people that are older than me. And so I always have to be careful. And sometimes I just say it, and everyone can just be mad at me, and that's fine. But every once in a while, I will start to feel old because of who I primarily am talking to. And so it dawned on me the other day that I am 20 years older than the junior high kids. I'm getting to the point where my son's in second grade, a few more years, and they're going to be my kids' age, and I'm probably going to feel even older then. But that 20 years, I ended up getting a calculator out and calculating how many days that is. I found out it's 7,300 days. I've lived over 7,000 more days than the junior high kids, and that was just like, that kind of hit me hard. I was like, wow, that's a lot of days that I've lived beyond them. My main point in sharing that with the youth kids was the problems that they're facing A lot of times just standard junior high age problems that we've all dealt with. The reality is they're going through it right here, right now, and it seems like it's the hardest thing in the world and seems like it's taking forever. The reality is you jump 20 years in the future and you look back at that time, you're like, it wasn't really that hard, wasn't that difficult, wasn't that long in comparison to other things. As you get more and more days under you and more time, you reflect and things aren't quite as bad or quite as long as you remember them to be. The main reason I bring this all up is that David did a good job of looking at the bigger picture. It certainly is tough and it's hard, and I get it. I've been there, done that. You're in that trial, you're in that struggle. It's hard to see beyond it sometimes. We need to do our best to look beyond it like David did. He looked to see and to remember that God was working and that he had a plan and that he was going to accomplish something out of it. And so we need to remember that these trials have limits, they have degrees that they can't go beyond. And that kind of leads into the end, or the last kind of truth reality is that we win because of the fact that God is in control. God gets the final say on how these things end. Not us, not anyone else. He gets to determine that. And so if you look at the example of David, the worst case scenario for him in those moments when he's running from his enemy is they would actually catch up to him and kill him. But the reality is that death would instantly turn to being in the presence of the Lord in heaven and not having to deal with the death and loss and hurt and pain anymore. And so even his worst case scenario means he has victory. And the same is true for us. We get to look forward to that time when we get to be in heaven. No more hurts, no more pains, all that stuff. And so we get to claim that victory. But not only do we get to claim that victory in the future, we as Christians can claim that victory right here, right now. I want to read for us Romans 8:31 through 39. Just an awesome passage that deals with this and deals with God's love. So Romans 8:31 through 39 says, "What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us, how will he not also with him freely give us all things? Who will bring a charge against God's elect? God is the one who justifies. Who is the one who condemns? Christ Jesus is he who died, yes, rather, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who also intercedes for us. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? Just as it is written, for your sake we are being put to death all day long. We were considered as sheep to be slaughtered. But in all these things we overwhelmingly conquer through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord." We can have victory right here, right now in this life because of Christ, because nothing can separate us from that love. Just the fact that while we were enemies, he died for us should speak volumes to the love that he has for us. And so nothing that comes our way can separate us from that love. And so we have victory certainly in the future, but we have victory right here, right now. Moving to the reason why we should be anticipating and waiting on God's judgment. The waiting on the Lord helps in a couple ways. The first is it prevents us from making mistakes. Helps us prevent stepping in and trying to fix things ourselves. David did an excellent job in this area. If you were to read 1 Samuel 24 and 26, I encourage you to do so. He had a couple opportunities that Saul was right before him, and he could have killed him, but he chose not to. He wanted the Lord to do what the Lord was going to do. He did not want the king's blood on his hand, and so there was a lot of people that was whispering in his ear, "Hey, here's your chance. God's given you this opportunity," and he was like, "Nope, I'm not going to do that." And so he was able to become the king without having any bloodshed on his hand, without having to kill the previous king. And there's a lot of kings that probably couldn't have that claim. And so that benefited his kingship as he took over once Saul was actually dead. You go to another Bible narrative in the past, Abraham and Sarah, they didn't wait on the Lord. They took things into their own hands, and they ended up having a child with Sarah's maid. And the Middle East has struggled ever since because of that decision to step in. And so we have to make sure that we need to wait on the Lord and let him do what he's going to do. And obviously, easier said than done, I get it. And so in doing that, though, it's going to show and also build our trust in the Lord. Obviously, Christmas has come and passed. One of the things that is a pretty common practice is the gift giving. If it was up to the kids, they would have all opened their presents as soon as you got back from the store. But the reality is, no, you wait. It's going to be worth it. Just wait, and it's going to be more enjoyable when you're able to open it all on that day. Another example, probably for me, in this regards, and I know I've mentioned this before, but a couple years prior to coming here, I thought I was going to another church, and then that didn't pan out. That didn't happen, and I remember just struggling. Why, God? Why did this happen? Obviously, I can fast forward now and be like, oh, that's why why that door shut, because you were planning for this church to open up and for me to be here. I'm on year 5 now, which seems kind of crazy that I've been here for almost 5 full years, and it's been awesome years, and I hope for many more years here. And but the reality is, if I hadn't have waited, I might not have had the blessing that this church has been. Again, as I mentioned, it's hard to wait. It stinks to wait. I get that. But when we're waiting on the Lord, though, it is so totally worth it. The outcome of waiting and anticipating on God shouldn't come as a surprise. What it is, it's again rejoicing in God. It's more of this praise and worship. I want to, like I said, I want to end with a definition, but I want to reread just one verse from our psalm there towards the end. Verse 11, it says, "But the king will rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him will glory." I want to kind of focus on that word glory, because the second definition, the word perseverance, is kind of the religious answer, and I really love this definition. It says in theology, which is just the fancy word for study of God, it says continuance in a state of grace to a state of glory. I want you to understand that is life right here, right now. We are living in a state of grace. I get that it's hard to see sometimes, especially when years like 2020 happen. Sometimes we need those reminders that we are living in God's grace. We're living in a state of grace. Because the reality is, if God were tomorrow to pack up and leave and say, nope, I'm done with this. I'm done with humans. I'm done with earth. I'm done with all of this. The reality is our world would then turn into hell. It would get way worse than it is now. Because that ultimately is the worst part of hell, will be the fact that God will not be there. But the reality and the truth is that that's not what God does. He hasn't left. He is present. He's working. His grace is being poured out on us and hopefully through us in a mighty way. That grace is all around us. Now, there's going to be one day, whether it's you're breathing your last breath or Jesus comes and gets us, but there's going to come a time where that glory or that grace is going to turn into that glory. And what an awesome day. That's a whole other sermon series about heaven and just the truths and realities. But man, no more sickness, no more sorrow, no more death, no more hurting. It's going to be a fantastic time. But the reality is, until then, we need to understand that we are living in God's grace, and we can make it through whatever this world throws at us. So whatever is in store for 2021, through God's grace, we can persevere through it. But we need to make sure that we're seeking His presence, we're remembering his power, and we're to wait on his judgment. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you for this day. Lord, I thank you for the year 2020. Lord, it again wasn't the year we had hoped for or anticipated or expected, but yet, Lord, it is the year that you've given us. A lot of good things have happened through these tough and trying times. Lord, help us to realize, help us to see them, help us to grow in them. Lord, we don't know what 2021 is going to look like. You do, though. And so if it's more of the same, if it's better, or if it's worse, again, we don't know. But Lord, give us the perseverance to deal with whatever comes our way. Whether it's big national stuff that happens to all of us or those personal struggles and trials that we go through individually. But Lord, help us to seek your presence, help us to remember your power, and help us to wait on your judgment and not to step in and rely on us. Lord, we need to be relying on you and your power and your presence, Lord. And so, Lord, may that be true of all of us as we not only end this year, but start next year. Lord, may that be true all year long. And Lord, we just thank you and we love you, and we just ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.